I see that we've got today with us Martha Lyon, Jeffrey Dirk, and Cliff Bulmer, who've appeared at this hearing before. I first want to extend my thanks on behalf of the board to our peer review consultants for being with us tonight. Thank you. I see the applicant is here and the applicant's consultants, representatives of the town, et cetera. Let me go through some preliminary remarks before we start. First, for those of you who are following along on the website, there's been several additions to the website. One is 2 traffic lighters from Mr. Dirk from VAI. One was a traffic report of a peer review report that supplemented his earlier report, to which he testified earlier. And then the second was a supplement to that. Both have been put on the website. We've got a letter from Mr. Bomer from Davis Square Architects. I know that he's here tonight. He will speak to that. We also have a letter from Sean Reardon from Tetra Tech. Now, Mr. Reardon commented on Mr. Burke's and the applicant's revised drainage design, which we learned at the last hearing has been supplemented, and there'll be some changes based on a independent conversation between Mr. Reardon and Mr. Burke. As you note on the schedule that we published, we're going to defer the conversation about Mr. Reardon's work, Mr. Burke's redesign, pending the completion of that redesign, at which point we're happy to take Mr. Burke's testimony to be supplemented by Mr. Reardon's testimony. I want to be as efficient as possible. So that's something I like to talk about, getting that scheduled based upon where the applicant is with respect to the design. I do want to note that the letter has been submitted. It's thoughtful, it's long, it's detailed. I'm sure it will be helpful to the applicant. It's on the website. I don't want to speak to it because I don't want to cause any confusion about where we are with the drainage, because I think the best we can say about the letter, other than it being professionally done, is that it's an interim letter and an interim report, because the design simply hadn't been advanced to a point where the applicant was satisfied that they wanted to submit it. So enough said about that. I just want to acknowledge for people following along that it's there, it's available, people can read it. That's what it's for. Fourth, we put out a revised schedule, which noted tonight's hearing, the purpose of tonight's hearing, which is a presentation by our peer review consultants, who I introduced earlier, Ms. Lyons, Mr. Dirk, and Mr. Bomer. I'd like to, I'm going to suggest that we take Mr. Dirk first, followed by Ms. Lyon, and then Mr. Bomer. My sense is that the bulk of the questions will be with respect to Ms. Bomer. I'll also note that Ms. Lyon, I think, is on the record with respect to her impression regarding the gardens, and we'll take her oral testimony. We didn't ask for a written report. I don't know that's one necessary, but we are interested in hearing from her with respect to the revision to the gardens. So that's really the substance of why we asked her to be here. Fifth, there's a landscape plan that Mr. Zawinski put on the website earlier this week that came in from the applicant. And then lastly, I just want to acknowledge that both Kathleen Adams and Mr. Paul Gallagher, have recently submitted letters, and they're in a comment file. I don't know that I've commented on those before, but I've certainly read them and appreciate their input. So that's a preliminary report. Let me ask before we turn it over to our peer review consultants, Mr. Schulmer, is there anything you'd like to share with the board at this time?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll report to the board at this time, and if Jim Burke, I know he's on the line, if he has anything further to say, he could chime in and supplement. But my understanding is that he and Mr. Reardon are still in the process of working through the drainage design, and I did have a chance to take a quick look at the letter from Mr. Reardon. And my understanding from Mr. Burke is that his impression is that most of the issues in that letter are things that can be resolved between the two of them. And so I'm optimistic about that by the next hearing, if you are inclined to entertain that issue, we'll be prepared to address that at that time.
So you're suggesting that on April 21st, that the subject of that hearing be a presentation by Mr. Burke, to be followed by a discussion by Mr. Reardon?
Well, I would say I know that you've slated the board has slated that is that hearing to be for the town department heads, the planning department, DPW, historical to come in and give their supplemental comments and feedback to the revised plan. But perhaps part of that hearing could be dedicated to drainage, unless, Mr. Chair, you think that that's a full hearing, in which case we'll defer to your judgment on that.
No, I'd rather, pending the availability of the town representatives, and I'll ask Mr. Zawinski to verify that. I'd rather hear from Mr. Burke to complete the presentation of the applicant's report, and then have the town officials have the opportunity to comment on a completed report, particularly Mr. Berkeley. I think that's, assuming that people can do that, I would much prefer that. The pleasure of the members, perhaps they could nod, or if they want to be recognized, they could be recognized at this time. Mr. O'Brien?
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you wholeheartedly. The drainage, the site civil issues in general are such important to the board and to the community at large that I think that the schedule that you've outlined and Mr. Schumer makes total sense.
Ms. Jaffe, you good?
Good evening. I agree.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll shoot for that. And then Mr. Zawinski, if you could let us know, if not tonight, that's fine, at some point, whether or not we could put the town officials off to the, I guess that would be April 28th.
Mr. Chair, that actually, I mean, that's probably all the same. It is school vacation next week, and I know that Mr. Berkeley is actually out. So he had deputized the town engineer to be present at that hearing and testify, but it may work out better for that hearing to be delayed so that he can be in attendance. So I will, I'll bump that out to the next week, and I think that'll be fine.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Mr. Zawinski. And that would also be fire. And we should make sure that we include the Milton Historical Commission. And anybody else who you think from town government that ought to be heard, including the planning board.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I see that Jim Burke has popped up on video,
Yes.
and I wonder if he's done that because he has anything further to add.
Mr. Burke.
Just that not only I've been in contact with Mr. Reardon, I've also had an opportunity to discuss the project with the new town engineer, Marina Fernandez, as well as Mr. Berkeley. They are looking at asking us to take a look at some of the drainage infrastructure off-site to make sure one of the requests that Mr. Reardon is that we do a hard pipe connection. And they are looking at to make sure that the existing infrastructure can handle that. So there is nuances are still kind of arriving with regards to this redesign, and I'm looking to get them tackled and wrestled to the ground. But the timing is something that I'll deal with, and I know the applicant is my client's anxious to get going, and I'm sure you guys are anxious to get some answers as well. So I'll look forward to getting something to this on the 28th.
Appreciate that. I mean, we are, though, to be the 21st, be the 21st.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, the thing about the 21st, Mr. Reardon won't have a chance to have an opportunity to review that, but
No, I know that, but he ought to be in attendance, and he can add, he can add some, a level of familiarity with the design that no one else really can, given his conversations with you. We can always have him supplement his report. And I'm sure that Mr. Hill and the Bose Hill Neighborhood Association would like an opportunity to speak to it too, which they'll be provided. I will say this to the applicant, and that is, if it's not ready, it's not ready. That's fine. We do want to advance the hearing, but I don't want to waste anybody's time with hearing on an incomplete design. We're pending this or that. I feel like for many of us, you start to lose a little bit of memory of what's in the design and what's not. So I myself would look forward to kind of a comprehensive, here's where we're going, here's what we're comfortable doing presentation. So, and I don't want to rush it given its importance. That's all I'll say. And to the extent we need to postpone next Wednesday, that's fine too. It's better, to me, that's preferable than to doing an incomplete job or further confusing people. So that's my view.
I'll give it a good push and we'll see where we're at. And,
That's fine. I know you will. I know you will. We appreciate that. Mr. Schomer?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing else for me. However, my client, Joe Tamposi, is on the line tonight, and I wonder if the boards would indulge us for just a couple of minutes. He'd like to make a brief statement to the board and to the public, if that's acceptable.
Mr. Tamposi?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome.
Good evening. So for the record, I'm Joe Tamposi. I represent Comprehensive Land Holdings, which is the owner of 582 Blue Hill Avenue, and also the applicant 582 Blue Hill Avenue LLC, which is applying for this comprehensive permit before the board. Really, I just wanted to make a very brief statement to thank the board members, the public, and the professionals who've been involved in this process so far. I know you may not always see us as the developers or hear us at the meetings, but we do attend every hearing and site walk. And we really appreciate how much time, effort, and energy has gone into this project. I want to assure you, the board members and the public, that we are listening to all the questions and comments and feedback that we've received so far. This project's made a major 180 to preserve the historic house and the gardens based on the overwhelming community feedback that we received. So when we make such significant changes and prioritize the preservation of the house and gardens, it does result in having to make trade-offs. But we think these types of trade-offs are worth it relative to the building height and setbacks and overall site layout. And listening to the communities and the zoning board's feedback on those aspects has resulted in an unequivocally better plan that preserves the house and gardens. So we look forward to hearing the peer reviewers' reports tonight, as well as the neighborhood groups' reports, and working with them to further refine and improve this project. We're really excited about the direction that this is going. And we also recognize that even though it can sometimes seem like a long and exhausting process of, I think the board mentioned it was the 14th hearing tonight, really understanding all of these issues and concerns and working through the best ways to address those is how high quality affordable housing gets built. So thank you again, Mr. Chair, and we look forward to another productive hearing tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Tamposi. Appreciate your thoughts. Okay, so Mr. Schomer, you're all set?
I'm all set, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right, so I want to back to the subject of the hearing. I see that Mr. Dirk, Ms. Lyon, and Mr. Bomer are here. You've heard from them before, so I won't introduce them or their qualifications other than to thank them for their work and to acknowledge their presence. I remind people that they are here for the purpose of supplementing their previous reports and are not going to give us an exhausting review of the extent of the review that's been undertaken, but rather to respond to the changes that have occurred with the application, and to give I'll just invite them to give a high-level summary of certainly in the case of Mr. Dirk and Mr. Bomer, the written reports that they've done, and from Ms. Lyons, we'd appreciate her observations of the impact on the garden and the historic home that the revised application has. And so with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Dirk to address the hearing. Mr. Dirk is with Finesse and Associates and is our peer reviewer for transportation traffic issues. Welcome, Mr. Dirk, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
Again, Jeffrey Dirk, Finesse and Associates, the board's transportation consultant. So as the chair had mentioned, we've completed a few reviews of the project. So there are 3 letters that are in the board's files, starting with the comprehensive review that we had performed of the original application. The board has heard testimony from the applicant on revisions to the site plan. Our subsequent reviews deal with those revisions. And if you recall from my original review, there are 3 specific areas that we focus in on. First was the transportation study and the impacts on the transportation system. Second was the site plan, and then lastly was parking. So by way of a summary of where we stand with regards to our review, the applicant has addressed all of our outstanding comments and questions in our review. So the outstanding items that we've listed relate to really details to be included on the final site plans, and I'll just hit upon kind of those major points. But just by way of summary of each of those three review areas that we had looked at, from the transportation impact assessment, we had asked the applicant to expand the study area to include one additional intersection, and that was the Blue Hill Avenue Robbins intersection, which the applicant has done. They've added that to the study area, completed traffic counts, a crash analysis, and subsequent analysis of impacts at that intersection. The project being reduced by about 22%, so from 118 residential units to 92, has a corresponding reduction in traffic. So for the board's perspective, now from a traffic volumes during the peak hours, the project is going to produce somewhere between 30 and 40 peak hour trips. So that's when you get away from the property, there's no more than 20 vehicles going in either direction as you get away from the property. So in terms of impacts, it's a reduction of impacts that produces somewhere between 2 to 3 vehicles per hour during the peak hour, essentially, or per minute during the peak hour. That's a level of impact that would not increase motorist delays or vehicle queuing at intersections as you get away from the property. And so that's basically the conclusion of the traffic analysis, was that as you looked at the capacity of the intersections, the project does not impact the capacity at any of the study intersections that they had. And in particular, with this reduction in traffic, it bears that out as well. There's also no high crash locations. And I think that's important as well as we look at safety in the area. So from a transportation perspective, the applicant has addressed all of our comments relating to the transportation analysis. The project's reduction in units has had a corresponding reduction in impacts at offsite intersections. So we're satisfied that the transportation analysis was conducted in the appropriate manners, and that the conclusions of the study, which were basically that the project does not have a detrimental impact on traffic operations or safety on the roadway, is sound, and we've confirmed those findings. So the second element of our review dealt with the site plan, and just focusing on the major areas that we'd asked the applicant to look at. The first was dealing with the access points into the property. The applicant provided some detailed site distance plans. So beyond the applicant's traffic engineer conducting site distance measurements, they actually produced 3-dimensional drawings of the sight lines. And so we affirm the fact that the applicant's measurements that they had done, their observations, confirmed that there was adequate sight lines. The set of drawings that the applicant has prepared demonstrates that also in 3 dimensions, showing that there are no obstructions to sight lines that would limit the sight distance below a level that would not be considered safe. So we've affirmed that as well. And again, it's been done in basically two different instances, field measurements and then physical drawings as well. So it's been validated in 2 cases. We've reviewed those and confirmed those findings. The second comment that we had relative to the access, if you might recall, had to do with the slope coming into Blue Hill Avenue. It was steeper than desirable. We desire to have 2% or less as you're approaching for a minimum distance of 50 feet. With the redesign of the plan that the applicant has undertaken and changing the layout of the buildings, it's had a corresponding change in the access configuration so that they have achieved no more than 2% within 50 feet of Blue Hill Avenue. So it's basically met that test of what we want to have in terms of safety for stopping as you come out to the intersection. And then lastly, in looking at circulation within the site, there's 2 significant benefits to the current redesign of the site. The first is the circulation at the front of the building. And remember, we were discussing how emergency vehicles would get to the front of the building, especially ambulances. The new circulation pattern with the circular drive that they've got there at the front of the building, they've demonstrated that an ambulance and can get into the circulating area and basically drive around the circle and then exit the property. So that was one of the items that needed to be improved as a part of the other site plan. The current site plan does address that. And then with regards to circulation itself within the site, so now the circulation, you've got a short section of 2-way circulation to get to basically that circular drive aisle coming from Blue Hill Ave. And then the circulation pattern is a 1-way pattern around the property in a clockwise direction and exiting by way of the southerly driveway. So that has some benefits in terms of improving the traffic flow within the site. But I think importantly as well, conflicts that we heard with drop off and pickup at the Delphi School, that driveway or where the vehicles from this property will be exiting because of this change in the circulation pattern, the majority of the traffic associated with this project will exit by way of the southern driveway and is now sufficiently removed from the driveway to Delphi Academy to eliminate the proximate conflicts that could potentially occur with drop-off and pickup operations. So it has multiple benefits to the way that the site operates, but it also does deal with that conflicting traffic pattern that was mentioned as well. So there's a significant benefit to that. The last item is the parking. If you recall, as a part of our review, we had suggested that the applicant provide at least 1.52 parking spaces per residential unit in order to meet accepted design guidelines for multifamily residential developments. The current proposal increases the parking supply to 1.55 spaces per residential unit. So it exceeds what the industry standard is for parking for a multifamily residential unit. It gives us that buffer that we'd like to have for additional visitors and guest parking within the site as well. So we do find that that's a significant improvement as well. So high-level summary of our review. And again, I think the conclusion here really in terms of our review is the applicant has addressed all of the comments that we've had. Any of the outstanding comments deal with details related to the site plans. And those details are adding some notes to the site plans, adding the site triangles to the driveways. There was one inconsistency between the plans that were used for the truck turning analysis and the site plans. That inconsistency had to do with the addition of a loading zone. That was close. It's basically along the south side of the drive aisle that goes around the building, approximate to where that circular drive area is. That's actually it's an improvement to the site plan. It was reflected on the plans that MDM, the transportation consultant, had. We do want to see that placed onto the final site plans because that's where moving vans would be able to pull over and any service vehicles in the site so that they don't need to take up a parking space. So as we get to those 1.55 or so parking ratio, having this loading zone means those loading vehicles or delivery vehicles do not need to stop in a parking space. So that keeps those spaces free for guests and visitors. So that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have now or later on in the evening.
Thank you, Mr. Dirk. Questions from the board?
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mr. Dirk, and thank you for your supplementary presentation. You said several times that the applicant has sort of addressed further questions, and so there's been a complete response. What is your overall view of the traffic situation, right? Do you have any concerns based on the full set of information that we now have in your own analysis?
I do not have any concerns. I think that the plan and looking through the comments and the suggestions that we had, the plans are sufficiently designed and the analyses that have been completed are sufficient enough to allow the board to properly condition the project in a way that would be able to ensure that after the project is constructed, that it will be operated and maintained in a sufficient manner so that it wouldn't create any safety issues with respect to the transportation infrastructure.
And we will certainly review the written report in detail. What would you identify as sort of the most important conditions that should be applied?
So the most important condition really deals with the access points into the property and making sure that they're properly controlled. And then I think also critically is making sure the sight lines are always provided to ideally exceed what the minimum standards are. And so some of the recommendations that we have and things that we've asked the applicant to place on the site plans will ensure that that takes place. And it's not just site distances now, it's site distances under all season conditions. So some of what you'll see in terms of the notes and things that we've asked the applicant to add to the site plan ensures that we don't have conditions where there's snow piles or anything like that placed within the site triangle areas. So I think there's, as a part of our review and some of the comments that either will be conditions or added to the site plan will maintain safe and efficient access to the property. It's provided as reviewed And we need to make sure as constructed and maintained in the future that that continues to be in place.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Brien.
No questions at this time, Mr. Chairman.
I don't have any further questions of Mr. Dirk as either. I think it may help Mr. Dirk in response to Ms. Joffre's questions. One supplemental piece of work that might be helpful is to itemize those conditions that you believe would be appropriate to go along with your professional review of the traffic, so that we have that as a guide as we further consider the application. I think that might be a good supplemental activity, and I think would be very helpful. And maybe Ms. Barrett can follow up on that. That's I know you folks have been interacting. Does it sound reasonable?
Absolutely. It's a typical course when it's appropriate, Mr. Chairman, that I would extract information from my reviews and put it in as a suggested list of conditions of approval.
The one thing we are interested in is one thing that you didn't talk about that we're interested in. We're interested in everything you noted, is increasing the mode split here. I mean, it's almost 100% auto dependent, and we had suggested at the last meeting that I'd like the applicant to explore with the MBTA a dedicated bus stop at the site. It's a flag route now. There is a bus stop further north before you get to the square. But I could see people hopping on the bus, even if they alight at Mattapan Station, or, further taking that bus to, or grabbing the 21 to Forest Hills where you connect to the Orange Line, So these are some things that we're exploring just to eliminate the intense auto dependency at this site,
Right. And the applicant is committed to a comprehensive transportation management program, which will include as a part of that list of conditions. And I will include that consultation with the MBTA to explore those opportunities as well.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Let me ask if there's any questions of Mr. Dirk before we move on. Mr. Hill has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dirk, I had a question on your comments on the site distance, and in particular the intersection site distance. The intersection site distance plan that was provided on March 24th, I think, is something that we actually asked for because we didn't. The original submission didn't contain one, and so Mr. Michaud had provided it and spoke to it at the last meeting. I raised a question at the time that it seemed like the intersection site distance was being measured from a point that seemed odd to me, and that the vehicle actually, can I share the screen, Mr. Chairman, and put that up on the screen?
That's something that Ms. Sutton needs to approve, but it's okay with me.
Okay.
Here we go.
All right. Thank you. Can you see that?
I can, yes.
Okay. So here's the car, the green car that Mr. Michaud has put on the site distance plan, and he's showing that the site triangle is, or the sight line being drawn from the driver's position here, but yet the car is in front of the stop line, not behind it. And when I talked to our traffic engineer, David Black, he said that's very unusual, that typically the sight distance is measured from behind the stop line, not in front of it. And I'm just curious as to what your feeling is on that, if anything. I didn't see any comments on this issue.
Right. So the sight line is measured at a point. It's defined by the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, so AASHTO. I know you're familiar with that term. So they require that sight line be measured at a point 14.5 feet back from the edge of the traveled way. So stop lines are not always placed at a position. They're placed in various positions to deal with conditions that exist at an intersection. And they may not be placed at a point where that 14.5 foot distance, that's the measurement distance where the driver's assumed to be, that distance doesn't always coincide to where the stop line is located. The stop line is the point where the vehicle is supposed to stop before proceeding, and a vehicle is allowed to go beyond the stop line when it's safe in order to get clear sight line. So you are allowed to go beyond the stop line if you need to in order to get clear sight line. So that's where the physical sight triangles are measured at a point 14.5 feet back from the edge of the traveled way. So that's where the measurements are all taken from. That may require that vehicle move beyond the stop line. And that is permissible if it's needed to be able to do the sight line. But I think the key thing really is that 14.5 feet back. We don't want it any closer than that. It needs to be at 14.5 feet back. And that's irrespective of where the stop line is located.
Okay, and when you say that the car it's permissible for the car to inch closer to the travel lane beyond the stop line, the stop bar, but is that acceptable if doing so would then block a dedicated bike lane or a dedicated multi-use lane?
Yeah, so the key thing is that vehicle has got to observe it. It is not supposed to be blocking the ability of a pedestrian or bicyclist to be able to use the path. So the way that the maneuver is made is it's basically a two-stage maneuver in that case. They pull up to the stop line, they observe that there's no pedestrians or bicycles coming, then they proceed forward, and then they complete their turning maneuver. So that's the assumption of how that maneuver is made.
So in the site package here, Mr. Michaud provided a diagram of what the future multi-use path would look like.
Right.
And as you can see here, the stop bar, again, is here. His sight line is measured past the stop bar.
Correct.
Where the car would essentially be blocking the multi-use lane.
Right.
And again, that just I'm not a traffic engineer, but from a layperson's common sense perspective, that just seems kind of strange to me that would be an acceptable position to be looking south and north to see if you can clear and enter the intersection. At that point, you're already blocking presumably an active bicycle and pedestrian lane.
There's, as these shared use paths become more common, this is a common situation that occurs, and it occurs a lot now on the DCR parkways. So you can go on any DCR parkways, and I'm thinking of Nonantum Road up where the Charles River Rowing Association is. There's a shared use path along that side of the pathway, and any vehicles that are exiting from the rowing center, which actually has a lot of traffic, they have to do this exact maneuver. And it's done in a two-step process, which is exactly what I described. So I do agree with you. It's not something that we see on a regular basis, but you're going to see more and more of these shared use paths because it's become, Mass DOT now has this as an accepted design practice to do this. Anytime you're crossing an unsignalized approach, this is the way that your exiting maneuvers are going to be made. And so in Boston, it actually is quite common that you're going to experience this. And it's not only these bike lanes, it also happens when you've got bus lanes, which you also see in Boston, because the stop lines are behind the bus lane that goes straight along across the intersection. In order to see, you've got to look, make sure there's not a bike or a bus coming, then proceed into that lane and then make your maneuver. So it may not be something that outside of kind of Boston that you see on a regular basis, but it's going to become more frequent and it's not uncommon.
All right, but you'll agree with me though that when the car makes that, you call it a 2-point maneuver, when the car does the second move,
yes,
to sit here
yes,
waiting for a clear exit point, that car is going to be blocking this lane, and so any bike coming up or down this lane, or I guess up this lane, is necessarily going to have to stop and wait for this car to leave.
Correct. Right. That's correct. That's gonna, as soon as this shared use path is put in place, every single side street and driveway is going to experience that. And that's the way the maneuvers are going to have to be made from not just these driveways, but every side street and driveway along this entire stretch of road.
Okay. And then with respect to this driveway, this is at an angle. And I thought that I saw somewhere in the Mass DOT design guidelines that the favored geometry of an intersection is a 90-degree angle, not an angle, because if you're sitting if you're in this car trying to exit onto Blue Hill Ave, it's much harder to look left. You're gonna have to strain your neck to find that car coming north on Blue Hill Ave. did you make any comments about the geometry of this intersection?
I didn't, because the angle is not great enough that it would cause an issue with regards to operations or a safety issue. And, you know, I also look at it where you can look at on this drawing, you know, the Voss Hill Lane approach is basically at the same angle. And it's not concerning if your angles aren't getting to the point where they're like 45 degrees or bigger. When you start to get to angles that are larger than, you know, maybe a 20 to 30 degree skew, that starts to have operational and safety issues, and we're not at that point. And so that's why I didn't raise it. Okay.
And am I correct that we don't have an auto turn analysis that shows that fire apparatus can navigate the entire loop road? I don't think they showed that. I think all they showed was an initial. I could find the auto turn here. I think it's in the back of the.
It should be in, I believe it's in the back of this, and they have they showed the ambulance going to the, so there's your, I think that's your truck.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Can the fire truck then navigate the entire loop road?
Yes.
Okay, I thought there was a question about that. Okay, that's all I had, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions of Mr. Dirk?
I have one, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Schomer?
Thank you. Just, I guess to put a period, if we could try to do that on these questions that Attorney Hill was asking about the layout of that intersection and the multi-use path. I guess my question for Mr. Dirk would be, do you have any safety concerns about the layout and the design of that? And if so, is there anything that could be done in terms of a condition for this project that could address any concern like that?
So I don't have any safety concerns of it. And the reason I say that is because the clear sight lines are provided. I think the important thing is here, specific to the shared use path, is number one, you know, the motorists have the stop condition. So they're, you know, they need to yield or stop, and that the bicyclists and pedestrians have the right of way. But the other important part of that is that stop condition also allows the motorist to see the bicyclist or pedestrian, and for the bicyclist or pedestrian to see them. But I think we want to make sure that's where it gets back to making sure that those sight lines are always kept clear, so that everyone can see each other at that intersection and see what the driver, the bicyclist or the pedestrian is doing at the intersection. And I think that's critical for that to take place. In terms of, you know, supplemental recommendations, I mean, we've already suggested that you want stop signs on both sides of that exiting driveway. So it's going to be readily apparent that you need to stop there. You know, it could also be advisable that you post a sign suggesting, or basically warning or advising motorists exiting to watch for pedestrians and bicyclists. So there are instances where you'd put a sign up there just to make sure that they're aware of the fact they're crossing the shared use path. Another consideration would be on the design of the crossing of the driveway, whether in fact you want to, and I'm not sure if the Mass DOT design has the driveway, it may be that that sidewalk is running, or the shared use path is running flush across the driveway, so that vehicles exiting are ramping up and then going back down, and the sidewalk basically is favored over vehicular traffic. If that's not the case, and they're ramping, and the pedestrians are ramping down and then ramping back up when they get to the other side of the driveway, then the idea would be to really look at doing some kind of textural treatment to the crossing, so that it's not just a painted crosswalk or pathway there, that you're actually using something that's more of like an imprinted type of pavement treatment or something there, just to make it stand out and be more visible and differentiated.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Dirk. Just one comment, if I may, regarding the issue of the loading area. I think that issue has to do with the fact that the engineering plans are changing fairly rapidly. So those actually have been shown in the most current plan, and I'll see to it that we get a copy of the most current plans into your hands so that you can confirm that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. All for me.
Anybody else? Other questions from Mr. Dirk?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. O'Brien?
Mr. Dirk, thank you and good evening. would it be fair to say that one of the concerns you would have, one of the conditions you would be considering would be one related to snow removal? It would seem to me that that would be the most likely site barrier.
Yes, yeah, that's one of the, in fact, it would be a condition, and we've asked that a note be placed on the site plan that requires snow to be removed as soon as it exceeds a certain height.
Thank you, Mr. Dirk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Further questions for Mr. Dirk? Okay, Mr. Dirk, thank you very much. We'll be in contact. Ms. Barrett will be in contact regarding the condition analysis. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Ms. Lyons, welcome back to the Board of Appeals. I wonder if you might share with us your impressions of the revised design and how that might affect or will affect your thoughts around the garden and landscape and the presentation of the site.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman,
You're
and
welcome.
good evening once again. Happy to be back. I was asked to take a look at the most recent set of drawings that were posted on the town website. I was able to review the architectural, engineering, and revised landscape plans, as well as Mr. Schomer's summary, all very informative. And so the review that I've done, as I mentioned when I met with you the last time, this property and the historic character of it, it was a larger composition. And so in looking at the revised plans, I'm thinking of it sort of through that lens. The garden is part of a larger composition. So I'm going to speak a little bit at first about the larger landscape and then focus down on the garden itself. So I found that in the new plans, there are several positive features from the plans that I looked at before. And of course, architect will address a lot of these, but the building footprints have been reduced. So that is allowing for the preservation of more historic features and overall increasing the amount of breadth on the site, which I think was a big concern, and particularly to me last time. The tree buffer along Blue Hill Avenue looks to be largely kept intact, which is an important, not only to help the property blend in with the surroundings, but also to assure a decent sense of scale. A playground space has been designed that is separate from the historic garden. And I think that that's important, just to separate those two functions. And the swimming pool that is located on the east side of the house is going to be replaced with a terrace. And I think that's a wise choice. One, because the pool was not original. And two, because I think that more outdoor space is always a good thing that people can roam around in. So those are all positives. Now, moving on to some of the observations that I had that are more concerning. And I will say that they raised a lot of questions for me that I'm going to pose back to the Board of Appeals, just things to consider as you move forward with this project. The row of evergreen trees that are proposed for the east end of the property, which is where the property is separated from Meeting House Lane, it doesn't feel to me like enough of a buffer to screen the property properly from that adjacent housing area. So I would recommend taking a look at that and see if there's a way that can be beefed up. I know that there's some engineering issues associated with that that will have to be worked around. The playground looks to measure about 40 or 45 by 40 or 45 or so. My question is this large enough to house the number of children that will occupy this site? It was just something to think about. The playground appears to be accessed from the north building by a set of steps. Those are shown on the architectural and engineering plans, but on the landscape plan, the playground is shown level with the first floor of the mansion. So that needs to be resolved. If this is a feature that is to be accessible, I think it really needs to be thought through and corrected. There's a series of orchard trees that are proposed again for the east side of the house below the garden. So there are a couple of concerns I have about this. This is a nice design feature. I think it would enhance the site, but just to caution that fruiting orchards in particular require a lot of maintenance, including pruning, feeding, fall cleanup of rotting fruit. And standard sized fruit trees are very large. They can get very large. They need to be spaced 15 or 20 feet apart minimum. On the drawings, they look to be more clustered. I also noticed on the engineering plans, and I realize these are in flux, that the orchard area has been slated as a spot for snow buildup, so pushing of snow. And that's not something that I would recommend, especially on a new set of trees, young trees. And then this is a question I asked the last time. It doesn't relate so much to the historic character of the site, but I am wondering where the dumpsters will be placed, how they'll be accessed. Waste removal trucks are typically fitted with a mechanical arm that lifts the dumpster overhead and onto the truck, and how much clearance is needed to do that. So this is a lot of people with a lot of garbage that needs to be accommodated. Focusing on the garden, a planting plan has not been provided as part of the drawings. So my question is, will the existing plants be retained or modified as needed to ensure the longevity of the garden? How is the garden going to be preserved? What specific preservation measures will be taken? Is there a long-term maintenance plan for the garden? And what's to ensure that once this is permitted, and in a few years, the maintenance becomes very unwieldy so that the garden is not removed? Another thing to question is the impact of 150 plus residents on the garden long-term. I brought that up at the last meeting. It was designed, as you recall, for one woman with a full-time estate gardener. It's a huge change in use. Relating to the engineering, I did notice that, again, the plans that I've seen, the engineering plans do not address the water features in the garden at all. There's a circular reflecting pool as well as a wall fountain. I'm wondering if these need upgrades. The engineering for these need upgrades. And one of the very, very important things to consider with this, it's going to be accessed by a lot of people, are the sanitation standards that are required by the Board of Health today, such as chlorination. And that's particularly concerned today with pandemics on the rise. And then finally, there was a shadow study done, I believe, on an early set of drawings that I saw. I didn't see them when I looked today, but my sense was that the shade that was shown on those drawings that reflected the impact of the western building on the garden was not accurate. So just in conclusion, I think that the developer and the design team are to be lauded for attempting to retain the house and the garden and the mature trees along Blue Hood Avenue, and to reduce the size of the building so that they can be arranged around the historic features. The property has much more breadth to it, and this is achieved by the smaller buildings, as well as by the extension of the terrace up the east side of the house. The separate playground space begins to address the desires of smaller children to climb, swing, and hang, and these activities are not suitable for the historic garden space. But the questions posed earlier regarding size of the playground, its elevation and access to it need to be answered. The orchard planting being proposed has the right intentions, but the size of the trees, spacing, long-term maintenance plans all need to be addressed, and snow should not be piled here. Location and circulation to and from the dumpsters needs to be addressed. And then finally, regarding preservation of the garden, I believe many questions remain. What is the long-term maintenance plan? Will an individual planting plan be prepared as part of the development? And if so, will it accommodate a new microclimate? How will the water features be engineered and retrofitted to meet modern public health standards? And perhaps most importantly, what will the impact of over 150 residents be on the longevity of this garden? And once the project is permitted and built, what will prevent its future removal? It's my summary, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lyons. Questions from the board? Ms. Joffer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Lyon, for the very organized and thoughtful report. With respect to the insufficient screening on Meeting House Lane, can you talk a little bit more about that? Whether there's a different type of tree you would recommend that would be sort of consistent with the history of the garden, and what your specific concerns are about this particular type of tree?
Well, a detailed planting plan has not been prepared. I should make that clear. The landscape architect has provided a list of plants, which is, I think, typical at this point in the development of this project. I did see several evergreen species on that. And what I would suggest as as that plan gets developed, to be using a taller species. And I would also try to either stagger them if possible, or introduce a couple of different layers of them so that it's a beefier edge.
Okay, thank you. No further questions from me.
All right, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, sorry, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you. You commented that the shadow study was not accurate.
I do not believe
Expand
so.
upon that.
Yeah. The western building, which is quite tall, the shadow study that I saw projected in the shoulder seasons where we had the long shadows, not much of a shadow at all. And I do believe that building, given its height and its location, really, it's on the west side of the garden. I think on the shoulder seasons, you'll have a much longer shadow than what is shown.
What do you base that on? Is it your experience, or is there something that you could point the board to and what you base that opinion on?
If I had the drawing in front of me, I could show you what I mean. I wasn't able to access it this afternoon when I looked for it, so I don't know if it was taken off the website.
I think we can take a look. We can take a look at that. I'm not sure myself exactly where it is.
Okay. I mean, the one thing about it is I'm not saying that it eliminates the ability for anything to grow in the garden. I just think that is going to have to be addressed as the garden gets, replanted or rethought through. It needs to be considered.
Addressed in the sense of the types of plantings, the maintenance plan, that
Correct.
sort of thing.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ms. Lyon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Ms. Lyons, I wonder if you could speak to whether or not you think that it's possible to mitigate the impact of increasing the intensity of use in the garden the way that it could be done by expanding the use of the garden from, as you say, one woman with a caretaker staff to 100 plus units or something to that effect. Is it possible through the introduction of a property management plan or asset management plan to regulate that, do you think? And have you seen that before?
Well, there certainly are management/maintenance plans for historic properties. That's done all the time. And I think that what would have to be done here is really assess what the impact is going to be. And to do this right would be to try to introduce what we would call a rehabilitation plan for the garden, which would be adapting it to contemporary and future uses. So it would change the garden, but the idea would be to honor its historic intent. So if it's was designed for one woman who probably didn't, walk through there that much, so that the turf was probably in pretty good condition, and now you have 150 people trotting through it all the time, that the turf isn't going to hold up. So there are ways that can be, managed, but it would take some thought and some redesign.
It's like the difference between Augusta National and Ponkapoag.
I'm not familiar with Ponkapoag, but I am familiar with Augusta.
Well, that's okay. Everybody listening is familiar with Ponkapoag.
My brother is a scratch golfer, though. I will say that.
Okay, well, maybe he could help.
He would be able to help.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I understand. I don't have any further questions. I wonder if the applicant or anybody else has questions for Ms. Lyon.
I do have just a couple of questions or
Mr. Schumer.
perhaps comments, if I may, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Good evening, Ms. Lyon. I see that our architect is on the line, and I wonder if he could perhaps put up the shadowing plan that his firm prepared, and if we could talk about that for a moment. But while he's perhaps scrambling for the show camera button, what I could say to you, Ms. Lyon, is with respect to the issues that you raised with the planting plan for the historic gardens, I can pass along to you that I have started the first steps in trying to track down the historical information that you pointed out to us from the University of Cornell. So that is in process, and we'll try to put our hands on those so we can see what the original planting plans were. And perhaps what I would suggest is that once, assuming we're able to get access to those during COVID, we would share those with you and perhaps request your recommendations. I see Dan Riggs is up on the computer. So Dan, if you wouldn't mind, if it please the chair, if you could put up on the share screen.
Please.
Just give me one moment while I find that packet. Okay. All right, if everyone can see my screen, just go back through the shadow study that we had conducted back in March. So we positioned our building according to GIS coordinates using our survey and the site topography to locate the building, to model it as accurately as we can. And we also have this sun coordinate diagram located below the diagram, showing the sun position at each of these times as well. So we can testify that, to the best of our knowledge and abilities, that this is accurate and taken at each of these times of the day, as accurate to the best of our knowledge, and really focusing on the winter solstice. So this is December 21st, taken this year, not that it really changes per year, but studying the building location at this point of the year. And as you can see in the compass here on the bottom right, the buildings are really located almost due north of the historic garden. And as you see in these solar diagrams below that, the sun path really kind of travels from the east to the west around these buildings, as you can see in the diagrams in the shadows above. And we'd be happy to share that model with anyone else who would like to double check our work and make sure that is accurate. We'd be happy to do that, and to work with anyone else who would like to study those shadow impacts as well. Hope that answers the question sufficiently.
Thank you, Daniel. That's it for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
You're welcome. Further questions? Okay, Ms. Lyon, thank you very much for your time.
Jeff, I'm sorry, Jeff.
Yeah.
Kathleen O'Donnell has her hand up.
Ms. O'Donnell, welcome to the board. Kathleen?
She must have stepped away.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll return to Ms. O'Donnell when she, or maybe she's there. I don't know, she just put herself on mute.
She did change it, yes.
Yeah. Ms. O'Donnell, you there? Okay, why don't we'll get back to her at a more convenient time.
Thank
Ms.
you, Jeff.
Lyon, thank you very much for your time and your presentation. Thank you. Mr. Bomar, welcome back to the Board of Appeals. I know you submitted a supplemental letter with your impressions on the revised design. I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts in whatever format you'd like, and then be available for questions.
Certainly, and I'm happy to be back here. I think in the spirit of what you were requesting about taking the high-level view, I did add significantly to the last letter that I did write. So there is a lot of detail in there, but I do want to just give my kind of overall impressions, and I will say that I haven't. I think I'm connecting with Miss Lyon in many ways. We're like channeling many of the same thoughts, even though we haven't spoken with each other. I think my overall impression is very clear that the preservation-driven approach is a really major improvement from where the project was before. On the kind of big view, what was in its first incarnation, at least the first incarnation that I saw, was a monumental kind of incongruous structure on top of a very large parking garage, is now moving towards I think a really interesting complex of buildings of a very different scale, certainly much more interesting. And as I said, preservation driven is a big, big change. Saving that garden, saving most of the house, repurposing the house is really the right direction, in my opinion. So that was very satisfying to see that. And I think that many of the comments that many of the reviewers had were really directly addressed. Where I'm at this point is, and I think the development team knows this, that design is an iterative process. I think the project is moving in the right direction, but I think it's at a point now where there's been, I think, really good detailed feedback from a lot of different fronts. Certainly, Ms. Lyon, I think, really has her eyes on how to truly preserve those gardens or make the most of that situation. The civil engineer has cited ongoing concerns with stormwater management and other related issues. His letter was, I think that just came out a day or two ago, was really interesting. And I understand the plans are already under revision. But where I'm at this point is that I think it needs one more pass on the site planning from a site planning perspective. And the theme that it runs in several places in my new report is the intensity of use. And what I mean by that is it's not density, it's not a density calculation, it's right sizing the project for the site and being certain that all of the good ideas that are possible on this site are actually doable. In my report, I kind of cut to the chase in what I think the most positive way to advance the design is, which is to continue to push the preservation-driven approach. And in my mind, that means that the northern building, the north building, should be cut back on the western end of the building so that it brings the historic home more into focus on the street side of the building. I think Martha was totally spot on citing the value of preserving the trees that are the forested area along the street. That is a really good move. It helps mitigate the scale of the building from the public realm. And I think the entry court idea is good. I think that from my perspective, it feels a little small, and I think that, and there are some parking spaces out in front that I think could potentially be eliminated if that western wing of the north building were cut back so that it's flush or perhaps somewhat in front of the historic building, but not nearly as far in front of it as it is now. That entry court could be reshaped, potentially integrating parking spaces and drop-off area into a larger entry court, to a larger circle, basically. I share Ms. Lyons' concern about inadequate screening on the Meeting House Lane side. The suggestion that I made for further study actually was probably eliminating that orchard space. The orchard area is in front of that existing historic garden wall, which I think is a really nice built element on the site. My suggestion as a potential way of creating better screening and better integrating the site in a more at a larger scale would be to excuse me, probably eliminate the orchard space and try to create wherever possible on the site double loaded parking, which would make better use of the drive lane. As I pointed out in my report, the big change in the parking plan was relocating many of the garage spaces to the outside. I think now there are 62 parking spaces on the outside. In the previous plan, it was far fewer than that, and they were mainly in the front yard of the space. But essentially, I think the other half of that, helping to address the intensity of use, is probably also reducing the eastern wing of the northern building. So removing some of that so that the parking, the drive, the circular drive or the loop road around the site could move towards the west some. So getting it further away from the Meeting House neighbors. I think that rather than having a completely open parking lot the way, or with no planting peninsulas or any such thing in that parking lot, if it were converted to a double loaded, making better use of that existing drive lane that is, for fire access, you could introduce landscaping into the parking area, which I think could help with screening of the building. Martha is correct that the existing, and the civil engineer also pointed this out, that the landscape plan really hasn't been coordinated or adequately detailed in some pretty important ways. I think, in particular, identifying trees that are slated for preservation versus ones that would be removed. I think the kind of final leg of reducing the intensity of the use that will help, I think, the issues of stormwater management that are cited by the civil engineer, issues of increasing the screening. It's critical, I think, at this point to start to develop a detailed construction management plan so that all of these elements that I think could add to a really nice larger composition are actually feasible. The site uses up most of the site, obviously. Most of the site is developed. And in order to really ensure that the trees along the roadway can be saved, I think you should ask for a much more detailed tree preservation plan and more detail in the landscape plans. I think I've read everything that's been written by every board and citizen who's submitted. I think there does seem to be a consensus about scale from most of the feedback. For me, I think that's what I'm calling intensity of use. I think when you tone down the number of units on the site, it helps a lot of things. It opens up more site space for stormwater management. It cuts down the number of people using the historic gardens. It would really help create some slack around the building to deal with what is a very nice idea and an idea that has progressed significantly, in my opinion. But I think it needs a kind of final round that integrates all of the feedback that they have gotten. So that's my overarching comments. There really are a lot of smaller details. I think the integration of the playground was a very good idea, having that separation between the passive use and more active uses is really good. I cited, as Ms. Lyon did in her report, I think we need to understand how all of the proposed amenities are accessible. That's not optional. It's it may be optional in some perspectives. It's not optional by state building code. Any proposed amenity on the site does have to be accessible. And there are, for example, stairways that come down from the historic garden down to the orchard level. And as I noted in the report, there could be some issues internal to circulation in the historic garden itself that would have to be addressed. Ms. Lyon mentioned getting to the playground. So to me, that's all the same category of making another run through, coordinating all of these comments. And I think it's really feasible to pull this together into a really nice project. I think the very last statement I made, or close to it, is I think the way it will finally get pulled together is through diminishing that intensity of use. I think that will start to make many things work that are marginal right now in the plan. A couple of comments that were far better, more detailed elevation drawings. That was really helpful. I think there was a nice balance struck between respect for the historic structures without imitating the structures. I think that's always important. I think there's a sensitive introduction of newer materials that is working quite well for breaking down the scale of the buildings. So there's clearly been a lot of thinking, both from a site planning perspective and from an architectural perspective. I think there was an additional gesture made on the Meeting House Lane side of the building by cutting that easternmost tail of the building down even a little bit lower. But as I stated previously, I think it should probably be pulled back a bit more. But I think that's basically it. I think it needs, from my perspective, there needs to be another round with all disciplines working from the same script. I think they've identified a good approach and they called it out as a preservation-driven approach. I think that is that would be the best way, in my opinion, to use this site. As far as the shadow studies, I looked at the shadow studies as well. And I think that I'm not a landscape architect. I want to make that really clear. But I do think that there is going to have to be some rethinking about what gets planted in that garden. Certainly, it's a big change for that garden to build a 4-story building right next to it. So I appreciate the efforts to research the history of that garden, but I'm imagining that between establishing accessibility through the garden and dealing with the modified microclimate that's created by that building, and not to mention just plain shadow impact, there will have to be some redesign. And I appreciate the board's notion of having that examined in detail. So that's where I'm at, and certainly happy to answer detailed questions or talk more from the 30,000 foot level.
Thank you, Mr. Bomer. Questions from the board?
Thank you, Mr.
Ms.
Chair.
Job.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Bomer. Thank you for your expert opinion and remarks. When you say intensity of use, what unit or units do you use to measure that? So is that occupancy, number of apartment units, size of building, or all of the above?
It's definitely all of the above, for sure. That it's all about kind of the big fit idea, and it includes everything from impact. I think that the remaining major impact issues are related to intensity of use, and I think that's on the Meeting House Lane side of the site. But at the same time, it's related to the impervious area and dealing with stormwater, parking spaces, a number of parking spaces versus areas that could be landscaped. So it's just it's all of the above. It's traffic impact, although I think we heard earlier that traffic may not be one of the top issues with this development. That's not my expertise at all. But it's kind of the integrated, all of the aspects of the development and how it sits on the site.
And what is your opinion based on what you know today and understanding that there's more information to come on how much the scale should be reduced to be ideal?
Well, I know what happens if I cut that building back to where I think it should be cut. There are different ways of decreasing it, but I think if the north building were trimmed back to reestablish the prominence of the historic building, that would result in a loss of probably 12 apartments. If the current plan stayed as it is, it doesn't mean you can't reorganize the plan or change unit sizes and adjust in other ways. But as currently planned, if it were cut back to where that stairwell is at the western end of the north building, I think you'd lose 12 units there. Reducing the length on the other end is maybe 8 units, something like that. So I think from a pure design perspective and making that composition work, creating more space for buffering, particularly on the meeting house lane side. It could mean diminishing as many as 20 units on that order. I'm not the designer, so I'm just drawing lines across existing plans that I didn't do. So I can't be too precise about that.
Right. Thank you. That's helpful, just as an order of magnitude.
Yep.
Thank you very much. No further questions, Mr. Chair.
Sure, Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Mr. Bomer. Thank you once again for joining us. I want to explore this intensity of use concept with you for just a moment. Is this one of those, I know it when I see it concepts?
Yes, I in a sense, but I think what has happened with this development is I think they've really latched on to a good idea. And once, if you know where you're trying to go with an idea, then you can look at all the various components and see if they're really supporting that idea or not. And so that it's more analytical than seeing it when I guess there is a lot of analysis involved. But I was struck by the degree to which all of the different letters that have been written, including the Historic Society, a couple comments by the Planning Board, the Civil Report, and what we heard from Martha tonight, once they are all kind of circling around the same issues, then it turns into a kind of intensity of use issue versus density, or it really is a fit thing. More, I hope that doesn't sound too vague, but I think it really is, in order to achieve what I think the developer has expressed that they do want to achieve, at least from the big changes that they have made and the direction they appear to be moving. I think getting the kind of wrangling that one to the ground of getting the right number of units, so you have the right amount of open space, you can create the proper amount of buffering to respect the neighbors who are going to be significantly impacted by the development. I think to pull all those pieces together, that's kind of I think that will prove to be the most fruitful direction to go.
Let me explore that a little bit further with you, because we began the evening with our friends from the engineering world talking about traffic and formulas and everything else. And is it fair to say that on this particular side of things, when we're talking about fit and intensity of use, that this is more art than science? There's no algorithm that we could point to that would take all of the factors into consideration and stick it in a machine and it comes out with a magic set of units.
Well, I think it sort of depends upon who you talk to. I think that some of the concepts that are easiest to wrap your arms around is if you filled a site so much, if there was so little space on the site and the entire site turned into impervious surface, and you had absolutely no way to deal with stormwater, I think everybody would recognize that site it's an intensity of use issue, because you can't deal with the problems that you create by the development. I think what maybe it's a little softer concept to talk about what's adequate buffering from neighbors. But on the other hand, those of us who've been doing this for a long time, I thought what Martha said was completely right. What we see in the landscape plans right now is just basically a straight line of trees that to people who look at plans like this, it looks like a wall, like you're trying to build a wall to hide something, and would it really work given the grade changes anyway? And the idea of having more depth to work with, so that you're not wall building, you're working with a landscape plan that can actually have more character and probably ultimately work much better. So some things are hard, some things are more engineering oriented. Many are visual, just visual issues. Other technical issues, if you fill a site out and you need to light the site, how is that parking driveway lit, or is it lit at all? And is there spillover of the lighting? So I'm not sure I'm answering your question perfectly, but the way it gets solved is through an iterative process, and listening to the various experts weigh in on, how do we pull together all these pieces so that it really is doing everything that we want it to do.
The applicant's representative reminded me early in the hearing that it was an iterative process. It certainly has, and I'm reminded of that every hearing.
Yeah.
I have one or two other questions I just would like to explore with you, and I apologize to my fellow board members for taking the time, but I think it's my view, somewhat important. You suggest a reduction in intensity of use, and you articulated your suggested reduction to my colleague, Ms. Joffer, by noting, 20 units here, 10 units there. I'm sure some folks are having palpitations for one reason or another with those numbers, but from my point of view, that type of number doesn't help me very much. Are we talking about, in your view, are the buildings too tall, too wide? Are you suggesting that, for example, the north building, you lop a floor off, or the west building, you lop a floor off, half a floor, full floor? Put it in layman's terms, somebody that a simple lawyer like me can understand.
Yeah, well, let me, in this world of what makes a right fit on a site, remember, 40B developments are kind of a special beast unto themselves, because there's obviously a strong incentive to create affordable housing. That's why the law exists in the first place. So that factors in as well. That if you find a site, and I know Judy has heard me say this many times, I think if you find a site where you can develop an approach to build a project that can really add to a community and fit into a community and achieve long-term sustainability through a really good fit in the community, then more units, if you're able to check every box, is in and of itself, through traffic and adequate buffering and water supply and everything else it plugs in to analyze a project, then supporting as many units as can create a good fit can be viewed as a good thing. So from my perspective, the most important parts to, I think, get this project working, potentially working on the site, has less to do with the height of that north building than the length of the north building. I think there are I thought the letter by the Historical Commission was excellent, actually. Very simple, 5 or 6 good ideas. I think they were hitting on, their suggestion was actually taking the entire top floor off of that north building, as well as cutting back the western leg of the of the north building, that would certainly push the idea of increasing the prominence of the historic building, for sure. It's not exactly where I landed. I think you get a greater benefit from really reducing that length in both directions, on the west end and the east end of the north building, and then reworking the ring road and parking so that you can create better buffering on the east side of the site. That's my own opinion. I think another strong suggestion I made was that I think the design team has really done a lot. They've done many more renderings, three-dimensional renderings that are hugely useful. And I think I don't believe was in the package were three-dimensional renderings, ground view renderings from Meeting House Lane. The public realm, particularly if you're retaining the tree growth along the road, and preserving mature trees. That's actually, and I think they're going to do a pretty good job of mitigating the scale of the west building. But it's the Meeting House Lane side that to me still looks like a work in progress.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any additional questions at this time, but I may, and I believe Ms. Lyon has her hand up, so I will defer to you.
Ms. Lyon.
Oh, thank you. I just want to add one thing to what Cliff said. I think this is making some really, really important points here. And I think that where Cliff and I share some trouble, it's just the context for these things is very important. It's one thing to design a nice building, provide check all the boxes and all the elements that need to be fulfilled. But if it's out of context, it makes it really, really difficult. And I think what Cliff is starting to do is to show that if you could just bring this more into context with the neighborhood, it would just help the project a lot, and all the people that are involved. And he's suggesting some good ways to do that.
Thank you. So I agree with that. I got a comment and a question. Mr. Bowman, what I'm hearing from you is that there's been one grand gesture made by the applicant to modify the initial application to save most of or a fair bit of the mansion and keep the garden intact. And that while that's helpful, there may be a need for, in your opinion, another grand gesture in terms of modifying the form to use Ms. Lyon's phrase, to bring it more into context with the local concern that's been expressed here regarding overall context and massing and site appearance. That's what I'm hearing. And that leads me to a conclusion that while it is about another grand gesture to get you into a ballpark to play with appropriately, or to modify the project to make it a good one, that there's a lot of detail here and hard work that goes into getting from those big gestures to a real workable project. Many of those details you've expressed, all of which seem to me to be feasible at some level. I don't know whether the applicant is going to move in that direction, but I wonder if you have an idea for the board as to how to get those details on paper. And I'll tell you why I'm interested in this is I've heard recommendations on, for example, we need a landscape plan that shows, kind of a simple thing, a landscape plan showing existing and proposed plantings. I agree with that, but I want that now. I want that part of the process so that it's not something to follow, because I feel like that's an important thing. We've heard consistently from the neighbors and from the town, the importance of these buffer areas, particularly on the extreme ends of the property. And then as applied to this particular property, the garden is an essential feature, thereby lending itself to the need to focus on planting, and the lack of real play area and dedicated play area is important. So I wonder if you've got a tactic or an idea on how to, address the grand gesture, but also get to these details that I think are critically important for making this project what I think you envision.
Mhm. Well, I might ask Judy to jump in for a minute, because I think, particularly given Mr. Tamposi's statement at the beginning, and it has been a lot of hearings and the project has changed a bit. I think from my perspective, I would maybe recommend a working session before you to get some of the bigger moves under, reach consensus on the most important bigger moves before asking for greater development of things that may want to change anyway. So I would put that out there, because I think the developer needs some time to integrate all of these thoughts. And I think having a working session, there are a lot of moving pieces here, and I think they're moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
Judy, does that make sense to you?
Ms.
You're
Barrett?
asking me, I'm sorry. Yeah, I do. I think that, I think if we had a working session, we'd probably find out pretty quickly just how much wiggle room there actually is to discuss any of this. So, I usually find them very helpful. Most applicants I know have found them helpful, and I would suggest it.
All right, so thank you, Ms. Barrett, and Mr. Schomer. At some point tonight, we'll ask you what your thoughts on that. I have a second question from Mr. Bomer. I'm interested in this ring road, the amount of room it takes up, the concerns that the Meeting House Lane neighbors have taken, and particularly the fact that it's elevated. It is going to present itself from that bottom grass area, which looks like a nice piece of open space, but is really inaccessible because of the fact that ring road is high. So you mentioned that we haven't seen an elevation of the Meeting House Lane. We haven't seen a view of the Meeting House Lane elevation. Exactly right, which I'd be interested in seeing. But I wonder if there's ways that you can think of that could mitigate the impact of that particular elevation, and at the same time try to make that space as usable as possible, given the premium on non-pervious. First of all, non-pervious surface, but also, it's a simple matter of play space or outdoor space,
Yeah. Well, it's tough. I mean, I threw out a couple ideas in my report of other potential ways of handling the parking. And, I thought, again, I think getting the ring road pushed further away from Meeting House, which I think Martha may not agree with this part, but I was thinking that the orchard element was maybe expendable, that could give them more space on that side. Another idea that I floated for the north side of the north building might be introduce angle parking. If you need to create to better use, you're building a 20-foot wide ring road, and most of it that's showing parking is all single loaded parking. So it's just inherently inefficient to do it that way. And even if you kept a similar length of some of the parking areas and could double load it and then do plantings, I think Martha was talking about integrating it into the community. And to me, that is a way. If you imagine a more kind of natural introduction of plantings that lead up to that, make a bigger incursion into the site rather than just building a wall is a kind of integrative gesture. But you're absolutely right. It's tough. And there are elevations. This current set of drawings really does a very nice job of elevating all the way around the building. It's much, much better than the last submission. But I was speaking specifically about perspective views,
I see.
three-dimensional perspective views from Meeting House Lane.
Yeah.
That will really help. And those views, all I know, and I know these architects, and I know they do that we use perspective views to design with. They're not just to show you guys, they're a design tool. And I think that would be the way I would encourage my staff to work towards a solution, would be to really take views that all of us agree are important views, and then work your design scheme in a way to really respect it and respect the neighbors and do a better job of tying in on that side. I want to say one more thing, and it's very common, and which is why it's back to that iterative thing. We always work our way around buildings. So you get a great idea, let's save the historic building. And so you make a big change and save the historic building, or save a big piece of it, but then you forget other things like, well, how well can I actually see the historic building? And what does it all look like from the other side? You work very carefully on elevations on one side of the building, and then maybe you haven't really worked your way all the way around the building. And that's why I was saying in this development, what is the kind of work in progress is the site plan, the parking plan. A lot of parking spaces moved to the outdoors that used to be indoors. And then I think I said it already, that it's really that view from Meeting House Lane that to me is the one that's the least resolved.
Fair enough. Thank you. I wonder if there are questions of Mr. Bomer. Mr. Hill.
Yeah, thank you. Cliff, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the applicability of some of the languages that's in the Chapter 40B design guidelines, as well as the statute. And I want to share my screen, if I may, just pulling up the statute, which I have on my desktop. And under the definition of consistent with local needs, this is Chapter 40B, Section 20. The definition of consistent with local needs is that the requirements and regulations shall be considered consistent if they're reasonable in view of the regional need for housing, and as well as the need to promote better site and building design in relation to the surroundings, preserve open spaces, etc. The statute itself expressly contemplates that zoning boards will be weighing and balancing these two things. You've got the need for housing in Milton, which is not disputed, but you've also got the need to promote better site design.
Yeah.
And then you've also got, let me just pull up the other document that I have here. You've also got these design guidelines, and this is the Chapter 40B design guidelines, Cliff, which I know you're very familiar with.
Yeah.
That state that when a board and when agencies are looking at these projects, the project should be looking at these types of these principles of the massing of the project should be modulated or stepped in perceived height, bulk, and scale to create an appropriate transition to adjoining sites. And what I thought was also relevant here is the relationship to adjacent streets. The manner in which the buildings relate to adjacent streets is important. Massing should take into account the pattern of the existing street frontage.
Yeah.
And Cliff, I know that in the projects that you and I have worked on together, you very frequently stress the impact of a project on the public realm. Yeah. And I can't think of a project where that is any more important than this one, where you've got a historic structure, very large historic structure on a very large lot, that in my mind is going to be probably blocked for the most part from view from Blue Hill Avenue. And I think what's really missing here is the 3D massing models that we typically see in these projects. And again, the projects that we've worked on together and others, an applicant would provide, a SketchUp model or some sort of 3D model that I think answers the questions that the chairman and other members of the board have been asking. How do we measure? How do we relate what is being shown on these two-dimensional plans? How do we know what this really is going to look like in reality once it's built? And I think, we've got, we had some plans drawn. In fact, if I can just go back to my inbox here, and I'll pull up, bear with me for a second. So this was and this is what I'm talking about in terms of a 3D model. This is the project site with the existing building and gardens preserved, with 3 new buildings. And these buildings were, 11,000 square feet of living area each. And so they're decent size, but you can get a good sense when you look at a 3D model as to how this fits in with the surrounding areas, which we don't have right now with the two-dimensional plans that were presented. And just for the board's edification, we actually proposed this to the applicant on February 4th. We proposed this alternative design, and we provided a few other perspectives that would show. In fact, here's another one here. This is the perspective from Blue Hill Avenue. So again, you do have a building, under this scenario, you'd have a building in front of the historic building, but it's nowhere near as large as the one that's being proposed. And you have 2 other buildings on the sides. But you can see from this model, these buildings that are proposed are not tremendously bigger than some of the bigger homes in the Delphic Academy. But yet they'd still allow the developer to achieve some of the objectives under Chapter 40B, which is to provide relaxation on density and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm wondering, Cliff, and I'm sorry for the long-winded question here, but I mean, shouldn't we be asking for this kind of model? And wouldn't this be helpful if we had the 3D massing model in more site sections so that we can actually see what these 2 new proposed buildings are going to look like? And should we be striving for something a little bit smaller? When you speak of intensity of use, like this is something I think that I'm assuming you would agree is a lot less intense when you break up the density and the number of units into smaller buildings.
Well, and Dan's completely right, and about the value of having accurate 3-dimensional representation, because it's not easy for people to visualize this, and it really is a critical design tool. So I completely agree, and I do think that well, and I think, as all of us know, any site, particularly a site of this size, has a lot of potential ways of developing it. But the way that you really test your goals and express that is through accurate representation. So I strongly believe that, and I do completely agree that the current design does obscure too much of the historic building, which is why, for me, to make this scheme work, and this is the scheme that the developer chose, to make this scheme work, I think it's really important to pull back on that western end of the north building. But well, Dan and I have been associated on a lot of projects, and that certainly is the right idea, to get better representation from the angles that we all know are critical angles.
So, Mr. Chairman, I guess I'd like to, through you, I'd like to ask that the board ask the applicant to produce these models, which I know D'Artagnan can do it in a heartbeat because he's done them before in other projects that I've been involved in. And it's a really simple task. The software programs are readily available. And I think that would help the board understand better, such as this kind of depiction, you know, how these buildings are going to fit in with the existing environment.
Thank you. Further questions, Mr. Hill?
That's all.
Any other questions of the applicant, of Mr. Bomer before we speak with the applicant? Okay, Mr. Schomer, so you heard Mr. Bomer's presentation. You heard my concern for trying to identify some of the, a response to these concerns, and you heard Mr. Hill's question. I wonder if you might address the applicant's reply and plans to address some of the issues that you've heard tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Bomer, for your very thorough review. We're still a little bit bruised from the last one, but this one was very helpful, as was the last one. What I would say, Mr. Chair, is I think we, as a team, we need to go back and take a close look at what Mr. Bomer has proposed and see what works and see what doesn't, see what our architects agree with and see what they don't. To go to a point I believe that you made, Mr. O'Brien, at a certain point in terms of architecture peer review, it becomes more of a discussion of art than it is a discussion of science. And I think we're getting close to that point, but I'm not an architect, so I won't pretend to opine intelligently on when we cross the line. In terms of Attorney Hill's suggestion that we provide additional 3D renderings, we're happy to do that. And we committed to doing that at the last site walk to provide 3D renderings from Meeting House Lane in particular. I think, the question for us as a development team at this point is where we come down in terms of, I think my client's preference at this point would be to make no changes, and the phrase that was mentioned tonight was grand gesture, and I think what my recommendation to my client would be somewhere in between those two, but we'll take a look at the plans and see what we can do and see what we can make work to address these concerns that Cliff has. I think a lot of these concerns are definitely addressable. And frankly, I think a lot of these concerns go more to artistic concerns regarding the presentation of the existing house and gardens, as opposed to intensity impacts. And I'm looking forward to our engineer working with the peer reviewer to hopefully address some of the offsite intensity impacts. So hopefully we can come back with the next hearing with a satisfactory bill of health from the peer reviewer with respect to things like stormwater, so we can start focusing more on the design specific questions that Mr. Bomer has in mind tonight. And I'll also just represent that I'll pass along the recommendations that he and Ms. Lyon had to our landscape architect with respect to what becomes of the orchard, whether that stays on the plan or is modified, or as Mr. Bomer suggested, removed entirely. Does that answer the question, Mr. Chair?
It does. I have to say, hearing you say that the applicant's desire is to make no changes is disappointing. I don't want to waste your time, my time, the town's time, the neighbor's time. If we're not going to continue to improve this in the iterative process, to use your phrase, you ought to just let us know that. If you are going to work with the town and the board and the neighbors on legitimate issues of local concern, we're all about that. We've certainly put in enough time to do that. So I hope that's not the message you're providing to us tonight.
That's not the message, Mr. Chair. And just to clarify that, from my perspective as an attorney for the project, and not speaking as an architect, in my view, where we are at this point in terms of the design questions is really outside of the realm of the kind of local concerns that Attorney Hill was citing in his presentation, and really more into the question of how do we make this project the best possible project for the neighborhood and for the developer and for the town in terms of providing affordable housing. And that's a critical question. And so we're committed to continuing to work to make this project better. We will take a look at it. We're not saying no at this point, but we do need to go back as a team and make the hard choices about what we can do.
Yeah, I want to urge people, you know, the goal, all the goals in the game get scored in the last minute because people give up and don't strive to make good things great. And that's why we're doing this. So I heard a lot of good ideas from Mr. Bomer that didn't seem to me I thought required some hard work, and we're certainly detail oriented, but projects like this are all about the details. And that's what we ought to be committing ourselves to. So I don't want to preach to you. You guys know what you're doing, but I want you to appropriately know what our expectations are. So this is a big deal for Milton. It's certainly a big deal for the neighborhood. It's a big deal for the concerns that you've heard, and it's an important matter for the Board of Appeals. So that's all. Message. I think you understand where we're coming from.
Mr.
Yes,
Chair,
yes, Mr. Chair.
if I
Message
may.
received and understood.
Sure, Mr. Tamposi.
Sure. So, you know, I would echo what Mr. Schomer said, and you know, we absolutely take your point, you know, with a great deal of consideration. What I'd say is this is the first time that we're hearing, you know, some of these concerns from Mr. Bomer. We just got his report either earlier today or yesterday. So we have to take time with our team to sit back and really understand the suggestions and understand the recommendations and how best to implement them, as Mr. Schomer said, in a way that, you know, that still makes the project work on our end. So, you know, if perhaps the tone was misread from Mr. Schomer's response that, you know, we're not open to looking at the project. We're absolutely looking to, you know, continuing to look at the project and find ways to improve it. But as we said, we need to sit back with our team and really assess, okay, these are the recommendations, where does it make sense for us and where does it not make sense?
Fair point. I wasn't responding to the tone as much as I was responding to the actual words that was said. So there's not been a concern about tone at all actually in this hearing, to which, you know, I think people should be proud. So, okay. So we understand each other. Let me, I think it's appropriate to take the time. I think it will take I think that will make it a better project, and I urge you to do that. And we look forward to hearing back from you on this point. Is that fair, Mr. Tamposi?
Yes, that is fair.
Okay. All right, good. Okay. Mr. Schomer, so next week, assuming that Mr. Burke can finalize the design of the stormwater and drainage issues, we would expect to hear a presentation from him on that to, in my mind, at least complete the applicant's presentation of this second round of design. And then I'd ask Ms. Barrett to arrange for Mr. Reardon from Tetra Tech to be available to supplement that, to answer questions, et cetera, and then to follow that up with some type of peer review, probably a supplemental letter of the letter that he's already submitted, so that people will have that. I understand that's vacation week, but so we'll do that next week. Are we agreed on that?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right. And obviously an opportunity for Q&A. Then we'll follow that up with potential additional testimony in the form of additional things you want to share with us in response to the peer review comments. Then we'll hear from town representatives, or maybe we hear from town representatives and then rebuttal from you or supplemental information from you. And then we'll hear from the neighbors, and we'll begin to bring this hearing to a close, or just give people a little bit of a forecast of what I think we expect over the next several weeks. And I think perhaps in the middle of May, we'll be on our way to deliberating the merits of the permit. I'm guessing, but that's what it feels like to me. If people have a major objection to my sense of that, you know, I'm certainly open to that, but I want to give people a little bit of roadmap as to what to expect. Does that sound right? Ms. Barrett.
Are you asking for Sean Reardon to be available next week? Because I'm not sure he is.
Yeah, if he could be, I think it would be ideal, assuming that Mr. Burke is ready. If he's not, I mean, I don't think we'll expect a presentation from him for the very same reasons that Mr. Tamposi is expressing a little bit of time to absorb it all, consider it, et cetera. So I just feel like he is, he's more knowledgeable than anybody other than Mr. Burke on the stormwater and drainage issues, and I think could add value. But if he's not available, I'd prefer to go forward for the purpose of keeping this moving.
Okay,
All of which is subject to Mr. Burke's completion of his review. If he's not finished, I think we would postpone tomorrow. We would cancel next week.
okay.
Does that sense of the board? Is that Giselle?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that sort of schedule and progress makes sense to me. I did want to respond to something Mr. Schomer said with respect to sort of whether the objective of at this point is to address significant local concerns, or we're in a world where we're trying to make sort of the best possible project. And in my view, they are one and the same, right? Like that is the sole purpose of the Board of Appeals. That is the legal standard, that we are addressing significant local concerns. And so all of these comments are directed only at that standard and sort of not above and beyond it. And so the way that I receive and interpret Mr. Bomer's expert advice is that the intensity of use or scaling is important precisely because it does impact issues like drainage. That may be one of the number one issues on the table, or the impact on neighbors, which also is a major issue that's gotten a lot of play. So I just, for purposes of a record, wanted to clarify that, right? That we're not in this space where we're asking anyone to go above and beyond the local concerns. Like this is entirely about significant local concerns.
Excellent point. Thank you. Mr. O'Brien, do you have something you want to, are you scratching your ear because you want to call my attention to you, or is that a little, what's going on?
As in Carol Burnett signaling that everything's okay.
Right.
A reference that Ms. Joffer may not get. I'm betraying my age.
She gets it. She gets it.
Mr. Schumer, I would urge you on the drainage report, consistent with Mr. DeSalle putting together a finished report, that you get it to the board at least the day before. It's not simple reading. As a non-engineer, I find myself reading it 2 or 3 times, highlighting stuff, circling things. So for me, and I assume my fellow board members, it would be much appreciated if we got it the day before so I can sit down, as opposed to scrambling with it that afternoon. So.
Understood.
Okay. Unless there's, thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Unless there's further business of the board, this Mr. Hill.
Mr. Chairman, is it possible to recognize my client, Rob Levash? I know he wanted to make a comment tonight about the design.
Yes, Mr. Levash.
Hey.
Welcome to the board.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about the massing and intensity of use that Cliff was talking about. I absolutely think the height has an issue with the historic house that's there. That one extra level, it really does overshadow the existing historic house, in my opinion. And so, when you're talking about massing and intensity of site, that historic house is 11,000 square feet. It's a pretty large building, right? And so I have a question for Cliff is that with this current program or with the current proposal, there's only 2 units in that 11,000 square foot of space. And so, you know, if we're talking about intensity of use, could you not put more units in that house and in that massing and reduce the overall scale of the other proposals? So, you know, to me, there's still a lot of work here to be done and a lot of massaging, and I've seen a lot of detail that has been done, and I just feel like we're not at that point yet. You know, back to Dan's point is, you know, we get back and look at massing of these overall proposals, and that should be the working session that we're at, is to really look at how we can massage this around the site. And, you know, obviously I'm an architect, and, you know, we worked on some other proposals, and that was one of them. It was to kind of, you know, reduce the scale and put, we're talking basically about square foot of buildings, and we broke it up further. So, I mean, I agree with you in the fact that there's many ways to slice it, right? But at the end of the day, it really is the intensity of use, which you know, it's just still not there yet. It's just, it's way too big. And I still think there's a lot of work here to be done for all the pieces. And as Dan said, you know, recreational use inside the building, in my opinion, if you could use the open space outside of the site, is that more of the advantage of the occupants there and the neighborhood to have more open space, and you can put more landscaping on the site, and you can put more units inside the building. So that's my comments. And you know, and I think having more open space would get rid of the impervious you know, paving and everything else that's on the site. It's just still way too intense for me.
Thank you, Mr. Levash. Ms. O'Donnell?
Mr. Mullins?
Yes.
I hope I'm just was wondering on the timing, we would be providing a letter from the planning board with our comments on these hearings and suggested conditions. And what date would you be looking at, April 28th or the week after?
We're inviting the planning board and other town officials to appear in front of us on April 28th, but I don't want to impose an obligation on the part of the planning board to, you know, to do anything that they're not comfortable with. So I would say, you know, in-person presentation on the 28th, written material at your convenience, but, you know, something that works within the schedule we're trying to adhere to. Does that make sense?
Yes, I will talk to Tim about it. I think we would be suggesting, we're obviously concerned about the protections of the trees on the Blue Hill Avenue side. We're concerned about the fact that I don't think the screening from Meeting House Lane is particularly effective. So it'd be interesting to see some sort of drawing that sort of shows how those trees, I mean, if they're only 2 feet high, but the building's 18 feet above that, it's not really going to be working very well. And lastly, some consideration about, as your consultant has suggested, about the protection of the garden. And we may want to consider imposing or requesting the imposition of some sort of a restriction on that, preservation restriction, that would probably just run to the town. So it'd be a 30-year restriction to make sure that after the permits are issued and everybody's in there, that there's a protection that continues for that garden. So those are our thoughts at the moment.
All right, that's helpful. Thank you. Oh, I will say, on the Meeting House Hill screening, that was a big part of a part of the site walk, and I think that may be on Mr. Schomer's list. I know the landscape design representative, whose name I'm forgetting, who was there, did acknowledge that there could be some more work done in that area, and I think that was part of the homework. So that's a good point. I know it's come up a few times in this.
Yeah, it's just sort of that you may have to put up a berm or something to sort of raise the height of the trees so they actually block something. So, yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ms. O'Donnell.
Thank you. That's it.
Before I recess the hearing, Mr. Schomer, I didn't hear a response.
Excuse me, Chair. We
Yes.
have one more hand.
Okay.
Where'd they go? They loaded. I'm sorry. It was Brett Jackson.
Okay, who is it? I don't see it here.
Brett Jackson, it was up.
Oh, okay.
He has an issue with Zoom, so I have to promote him. But I guess we'll just do that and see what happens.
I'm sorry, what are we doing?
He doesn't have a here he is again. Please unmute.
Yep.
Okay.
Mr. Jackson?
Hi, I'm a neighbor up the street. I live on at 216 Robin Street. Are you allowing, public comment?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say a couple of quick things. I've noticed, a lot of the responses to the redesign have been, overly positive. And I'm in agreement that the redesign from 1 to 2 is, a vast improvement. But obviously, what are we talking about? I mean, the original design was, was a monstrosity, and I don't think that was ever really going to be considered, acceptable. I've heard, Mr. Brown and Mr. Schomer repeatedly pat themselves on the back for the scaling back of the density and number of units, as well as saving the original house and garden. But saving, scaling back from a monstrosity really doesn't seem relevant. That first design couldn't have really been acceptable, I don't believe. But I'm surprised we're not talking about, at this point, moving forward with it, another redesign, which wouldn't dwarf and overshadow the mansion to something that, the neighborhood would agree is acceptable. That's really all I had to say, but I wanted to get that out there.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Schumer, I didn't know if you were going to respond to the request or the suggestion as to whether or not a working session was appropriate. Or is that going to be part of your reply?
I think that's a good idea, Mr. Chair, to do a workshop. But what I would say is maybe we could talk about that at the next meeting, because in my experience, and Judy obviously has more experience with this than I do, and she could chime in if she disagrees with me. The working group functions better when there's not an agreement, but a general consensus, I think, between the applicant and the board's consultants in terms of where the project is going and in terms of the broad strokes. So we have the next week to go back and look at Mr. Bomer's recommendations and consider how we're going to respond to those. And once we get to that point, I think we'll be in a better position to know if that's in the direction that he's recommending. So what I would request is that we maybe bring that up at the very start of next meeting.
We'll do. Okay.
And I would just also comment that those kind of workshops are absolutely extremely helpful. We've done them in the past on just about every 40B that we've permitted. It's an integral part of the process to really drill down on the details in a level that is really not possible to do in a public forum with everyone sitting and listening, particularly since all these hearings are happening on Zoom. I would recommend that happen as well.
Okay. All right. If there be no further business in front of the Board of Appeals tonight, I'm going to recess this hearing until 7 o'clock next Wednesday evening on April 21st. Have a good night.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Thanks.